Now that summer is finally here, it seems that everything in the manse garden is suddenly springing to life. Every gap in the soil, every crack in the paving, every dormant tub now seems to have shoots shooting up. But not all these shoots are welcome. I would confess that I'm not particularly experienced as a gardener, but already I feel like I have a lot of experience when it comes to weeding. I seem to spend an inordinate amount of my time in the garden clearing weeds. And I know that the only way to really get rid of a weed is to pull it up by the root. If we just take off the visible part that's above the ground, then that weed will quickly grow back again. And I know that it's quite easy to pull up a new weed, but the longer we leave them, the deeper their roots grow and the harder and more difficult it is to pull out. And what has this got to do with Jesus's passage today in the Sermon on the Mount? Well, Jesus is continuing his theme with what it means for him to be fulfilling the law. And now he's giving us some real examples of what we need to do to get to the root of the problem when it comes to doing the right thing. He's getting underneath and going further in the law than previously. In these passages on the law, we're moving from a different attitude which we looked at in the Beatitudes and what it is to be a Christian influence in society. And now we're moving on to a different altitude. We're going to go higher and further in our understanding of what righteousness means. It's not just about keeping rules and regulations. It's about having a change of heart. And Jesus wants to make it clear that our inner drives are more potent than our outer actions. To take us higher, we must first go lower. We must start by going to the depths of our nature, to the roots of our actions. And when we've pulled up any unhealthy roots, then we can go higher and further in our Christian lives. Dealing with what may be holding us back, those habitual sins and those bad habits. We just need to pull away from those. We need to uproot them in order to soar to new heights in being Christ-like. When Jesus said that he had come to fulfill the law, he was holding on to the foundations of what the Old Testament meant. But he seems to be moving the boundaries further than anyone was expecting. He was showing that the law is really there to show us how love acts. And Jesus takes the examples of the 6th and the 7th commandments. Thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not commit adultery. But he sets the bar even higher. He's essentially saying murder is not the disease, it's a symptom. Adultery is not the disease, it is a symptom. Murder's not the problem, anger is. Adultery is not the problem, lust is. And the cause of the disease goes deep. Murder and adultery are like weeds. We can see the top at the surface, but underneath the real root of the problem goes further down. And all sin stems from one place, the heart. In Proverbs 4 verse 23, it says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. And in Mark chapter 7, Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees and the teachers of the law about the fact that they are quite happy to observe the outer rituals, but they neglect what's going on in their heart. He says, nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them. What a great show we can make of being good Christians when in our hearts we're harboring jealousy, anger, contempt, prejudice, unkind and impure thoughts. But Jesus is calling for us to be radical Christians. Now, the word radical is a much used word nowadays and perhaps a little overused. But the origin of the word radical comes from the Latin word meaning root. So for centuries, the word radical meant getting to the root of something. And it's this radical transformation that Jesus is looking for in our lives. Reshaped lives need to start from the root up. But one of the problems is that weeds can look quite beautiful. They blend in with the plants that we want to keep, making it not so clear-cut about what are weeds and what are plants that we actually want growing. As we know, a good definition of a weed is a plant in the wrong place. And we don't always recognize when a plant is in the wrong place until it's too late and it starts to take over the garden. Sin often camouflages itself, and then when it is fully grown, it can be painful and hard work to remove. Russian novelist Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, "If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart?" So let's hone in now on the two weeds that Jesus is looking at here, anger and lust. Jesus starts with addressing anger and insults. John Stott says, "Anger and insult are ugly symptoms of a desire to get rid of somebody who stands in our way. Our thoughts, looks, and words all indicate that, as we sometimes dare to say, we wish he were dead." The word raka that Jesus mentions as an insult comes from an Aramaic term meaning empty-headed, insinuating a person's stupidity or inferiority. And what Jesus is saying is that even small grievances need to be dealt with. Grace, by striking at the root, leaves no house room for even the hint of hatred or contempt. Often we think that we have a right to be angry, don't we? But we should never confuse selfish anger with loving anger. We can be angry at things like human trafficking or the fact that the world is unfair and the way we are destroying the resources of the good things and the beauty of the world that God has given us. But it's not the same anger as when people do something to upset us or do something that negatively impacts us. And Jesus is looking at anger both inside the Christian community and also in the social setting. Settle anger out of church, settle anger out of court, but whatever you do, settle matters quickly, as it says in verse 25. If you remember that a brother or sister has a grievance against you, leave church immediately and put it right. Think about that for a moment. That is serious stuff. Leave church immediately and put it right. This is what seriously being church family is about. Likewise, if you have an unpaid debt, settle it before it goes to court. One example concerns a brother or sister, and the other example concerns an enemy. But both concern an immediacy of action. Because if we leave these things, they will only fester and they will spread and take over our lives. And so often this is what we find when we have grudges and fallings out. When we put on a facade that everything's okay, that we're right with one another, but we haven't really allowed God to change our hearts or to come to God in forgiveness. And then things just fester. Our anger erects a barrier not only between us and the other person, but between us and God. And the only way to deal with this kind of anger is through reconciliation. If we're not right with one another, we're not right with God. And this has a bearing on our worship. Worship and conduct go hand in hand. We cannot have a right relationship with God when our lives do not demonstrate a love of God with all our heart, soul and minds, and a love for one another. This means that God has to be Lord of every part of our lives. And this is the case with the second example that Jesus uses about lust, which is perhaps an even more hidden sin than anger. It will often be the case that only we know what the issues are for us. So this is where our personal integrity comes in. And what does integrity mean? Well, it means doing the right thing even when no one is watching us. It's about doing the right thing even when that is in secret, not just when we are on display for others to see. And Jesus must reign in every single corner of our lives. And as with anger, radical action is called for to get to the root of the problem and to deal with it quickly. Plucking out eyes or chopping off body limbs is not necessarily prescriptive or literal, but it is descriptive about the nature of the action that we need to take. If your weakness is stored on your hard drive, delete it. Don't look, don't touch, don't go. Behave as if your eyes had actually been removed. Behave as if your hands or your feet had indeed been amputated. But we don't just pull out weeds for the sake of pulling out weeds. We remove the weeds so that something else can grow there. The point is not just to pull out weeds, but to cultivate the garden. So we prepare the soil and we plant seeds. If we do these things, then we're not just leaving our garden unattended. If we do that, all that will happen is we're preparing a place, an empty space for new weeds to grow. Sometimes we need to clear things in order for the right things to grow. In our Christian lives, we constantly face the temptation to push and cram the new things that God wants to do in us, in with the old bad habits and the old behaviors of our past lives. And we can run the risk of squeezing Jesus into the gaps of our lives rather than clearing everything out first and starting anew, starting afresh. It's a bit like the story of the lecturer who was speaking to a room full of students. He took an empty glass jar and he put 3 or 4 large stones in it. And then he said to his students, "Is this glass jar full?" To which they replied yes, because no more large stones would fit into the jar. Then he took some gravel and he poured it into the jar. And he said to them, "Is the jar full now?" "Of course it was." "Right?" the students replied. Then he took some sand and he filled in the space between the rocks and the gravel. It was obvious that nothing more could go into the glass jar, surely. But then, finally, the lecturer took a jug of water and poured the water into all the gaps in the jar. Jesus should be the first thing we put into the jar, not the last thing, competing with so many other things in our lives, other priorities, other desires, all the things of self which we're not prepared to remove to make room for Jesus. Everything that God has ever done, everything that God ever will do, everything that God is doing today in our lives as well as in the world, all comes down to one purpose: that Jesus Christ might have first place, that he might be preeminent in everything, that he might be supreme. In Colossians chapter 1, verse 18, in one translation, it says that from every point of view, Jesus Christ might have first place. The more space we give to God, the more space he will fill. And from any direction, Jesus Christ will then be seen. And that must mean what's on display, but also what's under the surface. Not just our actions, but what's going on in our hearts. In our own lives, what would this look like? What areas of our lives is Christ looking for a radical change in? Addressing the root cause of sin is not an easy task, especially if we're dealing with sin that has taken deep root in our lives. We might be able to remove the visible parts and make the garden look nice for a while, but as long as that root remains, it would just keep growing back. Dealing with the symptoms of sin is a struggle, and we're doomed to failure if we don't allow Christ to get to the root of the problem in our lives by transforming our hearts through the work of the Holy Spirit. And as we clear the weeds from our lives, God will fill the spaces with more of who he is, and our lives will become like a beautiful, fragrant garden, lovingly tended, and where weeds are uprooted and grace is planted.